It's Thursday, August 29th. I'm Matt Harmon. Welcome to the Yahoo Fantasy Forecast. It is a hell of a day to talk ball, and I truly feel that way. It is a hell of a day to talk ball, and joining me to do just that is Sal Vetri. Sal, what's going on, buddy?
Not too much. It's been a while. It's great to reconnect on the airways, and we're in the heat of it. Had a draft last night, have a draft tomorrow night. I'm ready to get rolling.
Oh, I'm at that time of the year when, you've got people DMing you like, hey, man, you're on the clock. It's a slow draft type situation. I'm like, well, that's because there's like 3 of those going on right now. So I'm not quite sure. Did I make the pick in this one? Did I make the pick in the other one? It's that whole thing. So yeah, it's that time of the year, man. But I'm very excited that you're on the podcast. You're going to be on the show weekly during the season. More details on that to come, listeners. Probably I'll say like late this week, early next week, probably more like early next week in terms of our full in-season schedule. Because like you said, Sal, this thing is right around the corner. And that is why on the podcast this week, we're going through cram week. Okay. We are trying to get all of you ready as possible for your biggest and most important drafts. Like Sal mentioned, these things are happening right now as we speak. And of course, when we are cramming, anybody who's done a test, college, high school, post-grad, whatever, sometimes when you're cramming for that test last minute, you tend to get a little bit of panic. Okay. And that is what we do here on this show. We talk about the Panic Meter, and it's a very special edition of the Panic Meter. So let's bring it in, man.
Would you say it's time for everyone to panic?
Yes, I would, Kent.
Oh my God! Okay, it's happening.
No. Wait.
Everybody stay calm. What's the procedure? What's the procedure? Stay calm.
All right. So for those new to the Panic Meter, here's how it works. We take your submissions. If the player or situation bears no panic, some panic, total panic, and, worse, but certainly not least, players can end up in the coping corner. If you listened to the show last year, you remember that with Andy Behrens, where basically the coping corner just became Pollard's playground or Arthur Smith's Falcons. Like, we don't panic about these things because it's the reality of where we are. We're not going to get to that point here before the season, Sal, but we are going to talk some players that the people are already panicking on before the season even begins. But before we do that, I wanted to talk through headlines that are percolating on fantasy Twitter right now, starting with Sean McVay says that Kyren Williams is going to be the Rams punt returner. And fantasy Twitter fully freaked the hell out last night after the headlines got out. Let's hear what Sean McVay had to say in a recent presser.
Kyren Williams is going to be our punt returner. And it's another opportunity for him to get touches and impact the game. And you feel comfortable with that because of the confidence in Blake Corum and Ronnie Rivers, being able to spell him if need be.
All right, so Sal, I really want to dig into this with you. So take me through your reaction when you saw that Kyren Williams is going to be the Rams punt returner this season.
Yeah, this is a funny story. It wasn't just fantasy Twitter. I was in person disc golfing with my girlfriend's brother. He gets a sleeper notification, reads it, and goes, "So is Kyren Williams now the backup?" Like 100% seriously. So this is everywhere. He's asking me right there for my spot analysis on this. So I had a couple more minutes.
I hope you told him those were billable hours, by the way.
Yeah, for real. I told him to give me an extra mulligan out there. So basically, after a couple more minutes of getting to think about it, I came to the conclusion that I think it just makes me want to trade for Kyren Williams more from people like my girlfriend's brother there. So here's the situation. He's still the RB1 on this team. The entire offseason, we've gotten plenty of clips of Sean McVay speaking glowingly of Kyren Williams, basically gushing about all the different things that they can use him in the offense for. And then anytime he's asked about Blake Corum, it's kind of like, this guy was good in college. Let's see if he could prove it in the NFL. He went on the Athletic Football Show this offseason, and he said that, we have to keep Kyren healthy. So this is kind of the expectation that you're going to see a little bit less touches from Kyren Williams this year. That's why he's going as like the RB8 to RB10 in fantasy drafts. This headline pops up and everybody goes crazy, but I don't really think it's meaning too much here. I think there's a chance that it's probably just a situation where they want to get an extra roster spot. You say he's going to play both positions as a punt returner. Maybe by week 2 or week 3, somebody else takes over. And even if they don't, last year the Rams only had 28 punt returns. If your number one running back is back there this year, maybe you fair catch a couple more times. It's 15 to 20 punt returns this season. So if he's returning 1 punt a game, I don't think we have to get all crazy about that. Yeah, Blake Corum's probably going to see 30+% of the snaps in this offense, but we already knew that coming in after they drafted him. So I'm not getting too crazy. If anything, I'm trying to trade like a 5th round pick and a Joe Mixon for Kyren Williams if I can right now.
I like that analysis because I was kind of stunned that people really lost their mind about this headline. The full context of him talking about this is he was asked about two players that didn't make the Rams roster. Sean McVay was asked about these two players that didn't make the Rams roster. And basically those guys were kind of competing for the return job. And I think, like you said, saving a roster spot allows you to just like, hey, Kyren Williams can return punts. Let's do that. Actually, Kyren Williams handled 100%. This is from ESPN's Mike Clay. Kyren Williams handled 100% of the Rams punt returns from weeks 1 to 3 last season, and he played 86% of the offensive snaps, had 39 carries and 19 targets during that span. So we already knew this was kind of something in his bag in terms of the ability to play special teams. And, nobody's drafting Kyren Williams to play the role that he had last year. If we all expected he was going to have that workload that he did last year, he'd be a top 5 pick in fantasy drafts this year. He's not. He's like a, mid back half of the second rounder, maybe early third rounder in some drafts that are very wide receiver heavy. So you're already sort of baking in that he's not going to be the player he was last year, or at least you should have been from your preseason expectations. I think what's interesting too, and this is a really fascinating post by Davis Maddock, who noted that there has been just one running back since 2010 to have over 150 rushes and 10 punt returns. Alvin Kamara, who actually from a role perspective is a little bit similar with what Kyren Williams did last year. But if you, and then Davis noted this, if you expand this to, quote, very important offensive players, which basically he said had 100 targets and 10 punt returns, it's actually like a ton of elite wide receivers. I mean, Antonio Brown in 2015, Antonio Brown in 2014 had over 100 targets and 10 punt returns, like peak AB. Obviously, the Alvin Kamara season I just mentioned, but like Tyreek Hill has done this before. So I don't know if the headline of this guy's going to return punts didn't sway you off of like the best seasons of Antonio Brown or some of Tyreek Hill's best seasons. Shoot, even Dez Bryant, Odell Beckham fall into this cohort. So I thought that was a fascinating point that we've seen big time players just at the wide receiver position, not necessarily running back, but we've seen big time players hold the punt return job and still be high end difference makers. I think that makes me feel a little bit better about at least about Kyren Williams in fantasy this year.
Yeah, I think it's just, Jahmyr Gibbs to start the year last year was a kickoff returner for like week 1 and week 2 for the Lions. You have Jaden Reed returning punts at times last year for the Packers, arguably their number one asset on offense last season. So I think it's just kind of the timing of when this released. There's a bunch of cuts going on. There's a bunch of people going on IR. All of that information seems extremely important, and in some cases it is, especially for fantasy. So when something like that drops, it's like, okay, what are the stipulations that are coming from this? It's like where the brain jumps to when really there might not be much.
Yeah, that's where I'm at. If anything, it does make me feel two things I feel concretely. One, I am still nervous about Kyren Williams getting dinged up. And this is just it's more opportunities for him to touch the ball. But those are more opportunities for him to get injured. So I guess that would be the one thing I'd say is maybe gives me pause about this role. But the second thing is, I don't know how you feel about Blake Corum, Sal, but I do feel like this indicates that he's going to have a real role in this backfield, like a true, I don't know if it's going to be enough to be standalone fantasy value, like every single week running back 2 or running back 3, but I think he'll get into that what the heck flex range. And meanwhile, obviously, we know he does have huge contingent upside if anything was to happen with Kyren Williams. So I'm still drafting Kyren Williams at his ADP, but that also doesn't necessarily stop me from drafting Blake Corum, maybe just not necessarily on the same team.
Yeah, if you're going to return 15 to 20 punts this year, if that's what it ends up being, there's a percentage increase in risk for an injury, whatever that is, 5%, probably still less than 10% increase, but it's out there, which means Sean McVay knows that of all people. You probably have to have some more confidence in your backup this year compared to Ronnie Rivers last year and Zach Evans. So, yeah, I would say that Blake Corum, if anything, I'm not jumping off of the boat of Kyren Williams this year in terms of confidence, but yeah, Blake Corum rises a little bit.
All right, next little news item here. Dalvin Cook signs with the Dallas Cowboys practice squad. There has been some real insider whitewashing of Dalvin Cook's last season. I'll say it. I'll just leave it at that in some of the analysis of like, oh, he's visiting with the Cowboys, whatever. But like straight up, he was not an effective running back in 2023. Maybe he recaptures that form, like his old form again. But I like to typically think about these things as Scott Pianowski does, like in the cheese analogy. Once the cheese goes bad, it usually doesn't get unbad. I think that kind of tends to be the case with players and aging. But does this signing force you to adjust your Cowboys running back expectations at all? Or did you not really care about this backfield to begin with? Which I think is a fair answer.
Yeah, I would say it hasn't changed in adjusting. I've cared about it a little bit just because I expect this team to probably push towards being a top 10 offense for sure in that range. And if you have a starting running back that can see 55-60% of the touches in that backfield, they're all going after round 10 in fantasy drafts on the waiver wire in most leagues right now that have already drafted. So like Rico Dottle is appealing to me, although I realize he's never started a game before. He's barely ever touched the ball 100 times in a season. So there's not a lot of expectations there. But for Dalvin, it's tough to get too excited. Why has he lasted this long into the free agency processes? Is that his choice? Is that other teams just looking at him? There's also the shoulder. The shoulder's been an issue for what seems like a decade now, and it was an issue last year. He was on the injury report with the same shoulder that's plagued him for many years now. He just turned 29 years old, which isn't, you're not completely done at the running back position, but if you've shown signs of inefficiency and a recurring injury, it's not something that I can get behind. Especially when they signed Zeke earlier, gave him more money, or at least it seems like more money, and they have more confidence in him just from past experience, at least if we're thinking Jerry Jones.
Yeah, it's hard to really take a ton away from this just because we weren't drafting any of these Cowboys running backs with a priority pick anyways. I mean, there have been times when I'm on the clock in the 9th round, 10th round, and Rico Dowdle's there. I'm like, yeah, sure, let's take a shot because I think he can play a little bit. And like you said, I don't know if this offense is going to reach its previous heights just because there are a lot more question marks, at least on paper, with this team, and in my opinion, from a skill position standpoint, beyond Dak and CeeDee Lamb and Jake Ferguson a little bit. So I'm not 100% confident like this is a top 5 offense, but they'll be around the 10 to 12 sort of range. And because of that, we are interested in the starting running back of that team. We just don't necessarily know who that starting running back is. I am still going to go ahead and bet on Rico Dowdle as opposed to some of these guys like Zeke and Dalvin Cook, who we've seen their best years, by a long shot at this stage.
Right. Yeah, I completely agree. I'm not reading too much into this. It's not making me adjust any rankings at this point.
On that note, let's take a quick break, regroup, and get into some of the submissions to the People's Panic Meter right after this. All right, we're back. Let's get into the submissions to the People's Panic Meter. Starting off with this one, Barrett sends in via email, fantasymailbag@yahoosports.com. Mark Andrews and Zay Flowers. Last year, both Rashad Bateman and OBJ's roles were fairly minor. Isaiah likely only had value when Andrews was hurt, and they employed a committee of running backs that weren't especially notable other than Gus Edwards' prolific goal line numbers. Now, Bateman is having his first relatively, and that's a good way to say it, relatively healthy camp and performing well by all accounts. Likely reportedly looks like one of the best and most confident players on offense, and they made a splashy signing of one Derrick Henry. Mark Andrews and Zay Flowers have definitely been the most, other than Derrick Henry, like in terms of pass catchers. Andrews and Flowers are the most expensive Ravens that you could take in fantasy this year, Sal. Are you panicking about their roles maybe being a little bit smaller than their ADP suggests?
Well, based on the recent news that Barrett points out, no, that's not making me change any of my opinions. I think that might actually be the starting offense a lot of the times, those 2 tight ends and those 2 wide receivers that were brought up. But I think there's a pretty clear distinction between Andrews and likely, and at least right now, Zay Flowers and Rashad Bateman. So nothing changes these past couple weeks. And I think it's kind to say relatively healthy because he missed nearly 2 weeks of camp with an injury, which is like half of camp.
For Rashad Bateman, that's healthy, but not for normal NFL.
Yeah, missing half of camp is definitely trending up for him, but he should be good for week 1, at least as of right now. That's what it seems. But in terms of the overall landscape, I really haven't been too much on Zay Flowers this offseason. He started out as a 4th-round pick. Now he falls into the late 5th, so I'm a little bit okay there. But my thing is, he could be the 4th option in this offense. Obviously, it depends on the play and the situation. But Mark Andrews, Derrick Henry, Lamar Jackson's legs, those seem like priorities, at least to me, on a play-in, play-out basis. Zay Flowers wasn't used much downfield last year, but that could always change like we've seen in the past with a guy like Jalen Waddle, his rookie year, second year changes. That was a little different because the coaching staff changed as well. But this is a young player. He showed in college that he could win on the outside and downfield. So I'm not panicking too much based on the recent news, and definitely not on Mark Andrews, who I've said you could take as a tight end 1 overall. It would obviously be a little bit of a reach. You don't have to take him that high in drafts, but I wouldn't be shocked if that's where he finishes because he was that good last year when healthy. And he's only, still 28 years old?
Yeah, I've been really into drafting Andrews all offseason, and I've mentioned this at least in previous weeks that there's a gap really between those first 2 tight ends and kind of when you get to Trey McBride and then even to Andrews a little bit, who at different times was around the 58th overall player off the board on Yahoo drafts. And I think that's a great value for Mark Andrews. And with Zay Flowers, I'm kind of in line with consensus ADP where he goes as the wide receiver 27. I've got him in that same tier at wide receiver. I have him at wide receiver 30, but he's in the same group of guys like Tank Dell, T. Higgins, George Pickens, and Deontay Johnson and Chris Godwin. Like I honestly like taking all those guys in that range. Zay Flowers is someone that if he's just on the board, I'm totally fine taking him where he goes. I think there's probably a cap on his ceiling, right? Where I can maybe squint and see a higher ceiling for almost all of those guys I just mentioned. With Flowers, there are a few things blocking him. I love your point about I like looking at offenses as a whole ecosystem as opposed to just the target pecking order, because I think that with same thing within in Detroit with like Jameson Williams, he can be the second receiver on that team. But what does the second receiver on that team mean? Because you've still got two great running backs. You've got Amon-Ra St. Brown. You've got Sam Laporta. Like he could be the fifth option just on any given play, right? Or at least when you're constructing a play, you're designing a play. I think it's the same thing here with Zay Flowers. As you mentioned, Lamar Jackson scrambling is going to be an option, but I really like the player. That's why it's hard for me to say I have a pure fade on Zay Flowers, just because I really do enjoy him as a receiver. I think he can do much more than be a design touches merchant. I think you're right to point out in college he won against press coverage. And even last year in reception perception, he was a guy that dominated on those intermediate routes. Him and Lamar's connection just wasn't always there. So I think we're kind of on the same page with this one. It doesn't seem like either of us are panicking at all. I'm a no panic on these particular guys, even if I've just been kind of mildly drafting Zay Flowers at this point.
Yeah, I'm the same way. Week 1 season opener and a week away against the Chiefs, you're starting these guys and you're having no concerns.
Yeah. And I think it's a good base offense, by the way. The two tight ends, I think Likely's a really good player. I think Zay Flowers is an ascending receiver. And as listeners of this show know, I still have and always will have a candle lit for Rashad Bateman if he could just stay healthy. I think he's a great value that I've taken a lot late in drafts. Okay, let's move on to the next one here. This one comes in from @roar_restored. Jonathan Brooks, is he worth the IR stash? Should Nick Chubb be an afterthought this year? So we've got two running backs here. I mostly want to focus on Jonathan Brooks because he's in the news this week. He's going to be on the PUP. He's going to miss the first 4 games at least. Remember, at least is an important thing to say when these guys get on the PUP to start the season. So, Sal, Jonathan Brooks, are we panicking about him at this point, knowing that he is definitely going to miss the first 4 weeks of the season?
A little bit, but I'll kind of add some context to that. The fact that he went on the PUP list was definitely not 100% known, but it's not surprising. 3 or 4 weeks ago, his head coach, Dave Canales, said, yeah, the plan has always been he won't play the preseason, and we're hoping to get him back by week 3 or week 4. So now it's week 5, so it is a little bit pushed back, so that's not great. Was there a setback? This injury and surgery happened in November. 9 months would take us to about mid-August at that point. So some guys take 10 months. It's not anything crazy. So I'm not getting too worried as long as there's no reports of some sort of setback happening. But yeah, not having him for the first 4 weeks isn't great. But to your question, if you want to put him in your IR spot, why not? Do that. Add somebody else. Even add Keaton Mitchell, put him in your IR spot. Get all these guys in your IR spots. Why not, instead of on the waiver wire? If he comes back week 5, I do think he has a solid chance to pretty quickly get back into this backfield. They traded 2 fifth-round picks to trade up in the second round for Jonathan Brooks. Chuba Hubbard's a quality back, though, so that's kind of more so where the concern comes in. They have a nice schedule to start the year. They face a Saints and Chargers defensive line that really isn't the same as what it was maybe 3 years ago, 2 years ago even, and that's where Chuba Hubbard can maybe stand out and make this forced split backfield closer to halfway through the season. So that's where some of my panic comes in, that Chuba is a quality back. He was a top 10 back the final 7 games last year for fantasy, so if he's going to get a little bit of a runway, that's a concern. Yeah,
look, I think some panic is definitely where we're going to come down on this, because the reports was he was probably going to miss the first 3 weeks. You throw an extra game in there, and it's easy to speak, oh, it's one game, but these games matter, especially in the early part of the season. That's one thing we've hammered home on this podcast a lot, is that we want you to win September. It's nice to think okay, I'll just build my roster for the upside in the back half when the games really matter for fantasy. It's just a lot easier to do all that stuff when you get off to a hot start. So I think Brooks obviously is not going to be part of that plan. You can build your roster around that and have him as a guy that you're hoping is a back half hammer. You can still get off to a good start while drafting Jonathan Brooks. That's totally possible. It just makes it a little more difficult when you're in that range. And he's a guy that I've had to move down from kind of one of my favorite targets in this range to, just a guy that I think you're going to have to be sensitive to roster construction with. If again, I'm looking at consensus ADP on 4for4 right now. He goes after a bunch of guys that I think it's totally fair that he's going after, but the players that go after him, Tajay Spears, Zach Moss, Austin Eckler, Devin Singletary, I would just rather take the swing on Brooks than all of those players.
I completely agree. And in a draft I was in last night, a 12-team league, like right after the news broke that it'll be on the PUP to start the season, he fell to midway through the 10th round to me at that point. I mean, that's 115th overall, somewhere in that range. The names you were saying were like the only other guys, even some of them are already gone, on the board. At that point, if he's going to fall 1 to 2 rounds to where he was going 3 weeks ago when we had similar information, now I think any risk is kind of getting baked out of it. And you can get Chuba Hubbard in like round 12 right after that.
Yeah, Chuba's a guy that I think I've come up on a little bit. He's just he's definitely not a special back, I don't think, but he's perfectly functional, and I think they can get away with him in the first few weeks of the season. And I think he'll probably stick around a little bit just so they don't grind Brooks into the dust in his rookie season. That would make no sense. Okay, let's move on to the next one here. This one comes in from Fantasy Chief. I think I get that. Devontae Adams playing in his 11th season in a slow offense with this guy throwing him the ball. He sends in a Minshew meme. Gardner Minshew is kind of the perfect meme quarterback at this point, but not a great NFL starter is Gardner Minshew. So Devontae Adams, Sal, I think he's still one of the best receivers in the league, but God, I just wish he was playing with any other team. Honestly, it's not, Sal, it's not even that I wish he was playing with any other team. I just kind of wish there was almost any other quarterback situation for this skill position group here, because I like these players a lot. Devontae Adams, chief among them, but Jacoby Myers is good. Brock Bowers is really intriguing. So yeah, he's starting the season is Gardner Minshew. Is he going to play the whole year? Probably not. How have you been approaching Devontae Adams in your fantasy drafts this year?
Yeah, I don't have much of him unless he falls maybe a round in best ball, which is even rare at that point, because I think a lot of people recognize that, the quarterback situation isn't great. The offense overall isn't great. Probably going to lean a little bit run heavy, maybe be a slower offense based on who's there in that personnel in terms of coaching staffs. So none of that is fun. He's turning 32 this year, which, again, he's been a great receiver, but at some point, things are going to have to start to fall off like it does for all the great receivers, Julio Jones more recently, these types of players, Antonio Brown in some different regards. But yeah, I think that I'm not really panicked in terms of recent news, but overall, I'm not drafting him that much. The problem with it, though, is it's hard to get too worried about this because, worst case scenario, what's he going to see 150 targets? How is he really going to hurt you? He's not going to finish as a 7th round pick, barring an injury at that point, even if the offense is terrible. You take him in the 2nd round, maybe you get an early 4th round value, worst case scenario, barring injury. So I'm not getting him in round 2, but I don't think he's going to absolutely tank your teams.
Yeah, that's the way I look at it too. I have him ranked pretty much right in line with where he goes. He's wide receiver 10 in consensus ADP. I have him at wide receiver 11. So I haven't gotten him a lot either, but he's still I hate to say it like this, but he's still Devontae Adams, right? He's still a great player. He's still going to moonwalk into probably a 28 to 30% target share. He's going to earn those targets because he's still very good. And yeah, I mean, that's probably not going to tank your season. It's maybe not going to give you a 2nd round value, and that's why I've just been clicking other names, but it's hard to rank him any lower than wide receiver 10, wide receiver 11, wide receiver 12, just because you start to weigh him against the other players there. You get into some really murky target trees. You get into some really, some other, serious questions about guys that are number 2s on their teams, like Jalen Waddle, or something like that. Deebo Samuel, DJ Moore, these guys that are in crowded target trees. So with Adams, I've been ranking him where he goes, but not really taking him, which I guess you could kind of raise an eyebrow at that. But there's just a lot of it's just hard to get excited about a guy that's going to catch passes from Gardner Minshew and a different type of player too, Sal. I think people would immediately push back that Michael Pittman had a fringe wide receiver 1 type of season with Gardner Minshew, but those two guys are very different players in terms of where they're going to be deployed and how they're going to the structure of this offense in Las Vegas as opposed to what they were doing with heavy RPOs in Indianapolis last year.
Yeah, and it's also part of it is just the structure of drafting at that point. If I don't get the way that he's falling, if I don't get one of those top 3 running backs in round 1 with probably a top 5 or 6 pick, I'm usually taking a Devon Achane or maybe an Isaiah Pacheco at that range in the draft instead, just because I want to secure one in those first 2 picks.
I've been drafting the same way, especially if I go receiver in round 1. All of those running backs there in round 2 sort of have question marks. There's no doubt about that. We just talked about Kyren Williams at the top, who you've got to weigh, the Blake Corum factor there. But I think all of those guys are good 2nd round picks, maybe a little bit better than a Devontae Adams type of wide receiver. All right, let's move on to the next one here. This one's Pete Farmer sends us in Jahmyr Gibbs and his gigantic timeshare with David Montgomery. Sal, I'm not panicking about Jahmyr Gibbs. Like this it is what it is. If there was no David Montgomery, maybe Jahmyr Gibbs would be a candidate for the first overall pick, but he's not. So I'm not panicking on this at all. This just is what it is.
Yeah, it's baked into where he goes right now. If anything, the hamstring injury that Gibbs is dealing with that doesn't seem to be an injury for his or an issue for his week 1 status has made him fall into the early second round a lot of the time. So you don't even have to spend that first round pick on him in a lot of instances. So yeah, I'm not really concerned. Last year, even towards the second half of the season, David Montgomery only saw over 51% of the snaps one time in 8 of his final 9 games. So it was Gibbs starting to see a lot more usage in an offense that a lot of people believe is the number 1 offensive line coming in this year as well. Similar things last year. Bring back Ben Johnson, their offensive coordinator, who loved to utilize Gibbs, especially down the stretch last year. So I'm not concerned. This guy finishes the RB8 as a rookie, where he started the season slower. And if anything happened to Montgomery, who's an aging back, he might see number 1 overall usage week in and week out.
Right. That's a great point that he has contingent value. We think about David Montgomery, and I like to draft David Montgomery because he has great contingent value if something happens to Jahmyr Gibbs. But yeah, David Montgomery goes down, like they're going to build the whole backfield out of Jahmyr Gibbs. I don't think they'll get like a Craig Reynolds or somebody like that, and at least deeply involved here. So that's a great point about his contingent value. I'll just say this, man, like, and I'm going to be a little harsh with you here, listeners. If you draft Jahmyr Gibbs and you get pissed off about David Montgomery at some point this season, you're just not built for this. Okay. Like you're not built for this hobby. If David Montgomery, you take Jahmyr Gibbs and you get irritated about David Montgomery at some point this season, like this isn't for you. Like you know this, okay? You know that David Montgomery is going to be a big part of this backfield. It would be crazy of you to assume otherwise. So I'm not panicking about Jahmyr Gibbs, Sal. I'm panicking about the people who are going to let something so obvious affect their mental health. Like, just accept it right now. Know that like a couple of times a year, Dave Montgomery is going to steal a goal line touchdown away or something like that, and just be okay with it. And that way you can truly find some peace this season.
Well said. Can we get producer Colin to clip that part where you said you're not built for this hobby? I want to send that to all my league mates when I beat them this year after each week. That's just fantastic work.
Oh, it's highlighted and will be a social card. Don't worry.
There we go.
There Perfect. We go. Great. There we go. Yeah. This definitely will not come back to bite me in the ass. There's no way that will ever look bad on me. Okay. Let's move on to the next one here. This one comes from @America'sTeam LOL. I like that as well. It's just a picture of Puka Nacua. Sal, I'm curious about where you stand on Puka this season, because I feel like we've discussed Cooper Kupp. It's, just so much, right? Like as a potential value pick, anything like that, where he's creeped up has Cooper Kupp. He's now the wide receiver 16 off the board, which I think is totally fair. Meanwhile, Puka Nacua is still well ahead of him as the wide receiver 8. I'm curious, just where do you stand on Puka Nacua this season?
Yeah, it's changed as the past month has gone on. Like you said, when Puka was a top 10 overall pick in drafts and Kupp was a 4th round pick, I wasn't really seeing why that was such a wide range. You had these guys playing in 10 completed games together last year. They averaged both 8.5 targets per game in the games that they both started and completed together. Both were around 15 fantasy points per game, and that's while Kupp was playing through the hamstring and ankle injury that entire time. But now that they're a 2nd-round pick and basically a 3rd-round pick is where Kupp's going at the end of the 3rd now, it's okay. Like, it's fine to me. If you want to take Puka as the 16th, 18th overall player, I'm completely fine with that. I will say, the burst of sack injury, I didn't know at all what that was until 2 or 3 weeks ago. All I've found on it is that this is something that takes weeks. There hasn't even been a range. Like some places say 4 to 6 weeks, but it's just usually weeks, like pretty vague. So everything seems like he's going to play week 1. They said that seen participating at practice earlier this week. We don't know to what extent, but I would just say that that's maybe like one thing that's still floating out there for me. Like, okay, maybe he does. Like, it's not a certain thing that he's playing week 1. They've kind of alluded to that he should be, but we don't have that confirmation just yet.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to just, obviously the injury is one thing, and it's always worth noting with Puka that the reason he fell to the 3rd day of the draft, he was a good prospect. He just had a ton of injury concerns that sort of set his college career sort of off kilter. But man, he was awesome as a rookie. And even when people put these splits up together of, well, Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua is pretty close, right? When they were both healthy, Puka Nacua still led the team in terms of pretty much any relevant wide receiver stat. And I just know that at some point you're basically betting on a guy that's at the career point of Cooper Kupp, which is he's had serious injuries for each of the last 2-3 seasons. Last 2 seasons, really. 2021, obviously, he was healthy, but in this offseason, he's been healthy. So we'll say the better half of the last 2 years, he's had serious injury issues. He's, I think, a declining player. He's not the player that he was in 2021, but I don't think he's fallen off the cliff yet. But I always say that wide receiver age cliffs are really difficult to pin down. It's kind of a case-by-case basis. I think they even changed his roll up a little bit last year to account for some of that aging. And, again, that's the guy that at this point in his career where he's at. Then you look at Puka Nacua, who's just, clearly ascending, right? Now, maybe he never hits like 1,500 receiving yards or close to it again like he did last year, but man, there's still a lot of room to grow as a player. So I think the gap that is currently in these two players' ADP, 13th overall for Puka Nacua, and 29th overall for Cooper Kupp, that is appropriate, I think. So Puka is a player I would totally love to draft at this point. Would totally love to have in Dynasty. I don't really have any panic on him.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think where the gap currently exists, I'm fine with. The one thing I'll point out, this is just kind of overall for the Rams offense, is just to track their offensive line issues right now. They did get Jonah Jackson back last week of practice with Matt Stafford, so that's good to see that those guys are there, but still have 2 of their starting offensive linemen banged up. This is a unit that probably exceeded expectations last year, which helped the whole offense kind of exceed expectations, and they need that to happen again for that line to stay healthy. There's not a ton of depth there, and if you don't have a great offensive line, some things can fall apart when trying to find your receivers downfield, so something to just monitor the next week or two.
Yeah, it's not as if we have any recent evidence of offensive line issues completely destroying a Rams football season. Not that that's happened anytime recently. Yeah. Okay, let's move on to the next one here. This one comes in from Chairman and just says Trent Williams. Sal, I'll spoil alert this one. I'm a little bit, I don't know about total panic, but I'm panicking about this Trent Williams situation for the San Francisco 49ers, where there are very few offensive linemen in the NFL that I think totally change the picture of their offense, and especially as fantasy analysts would force us to okay, let's go back to the drawing board in terms of how we kind of conceptualize this ecosystem. Trent Williams is definitely one of them, though. He's been the best left tackle in the league for a long time now. The 49ers truly weaponize him as an offensive tackle, which not many teams do and not many teams can do because they don't have a Trent Williams. And by all accounts, by all reports, he is not going to play unless he gets a new contract this year. And the 49ers are just kind of in a rock and a hard place in terms of their salary cap situation right now, which is why Brandon Ayuk is still unsigned and nothing has happened with that situation. So I'm not saying that the 49ers are like a house of cards, but you start to pull a little bit away. You pull a Trent Williams out, you pull a Brandon Ayuk out if something happens there in terms of a trade finally, or he doesn't want to play this season. We're definitely looking at a very differently constructed offense. So I'm pretty panicked about Trent Williams if he is not on the field in week 1.
Yeah, you look at the 49ers, loads of talent, the best of the best at almost each position when you're talking about Fred Warner, linebackers, Christian McCaffrey, running back. You could even go Nick Bosa, but I think Trent Williams is their best player on their entire team. He kind of what makes this system go, and he's 36 years old. He's made, I believe, well over $100 million in the NFL. He doesn't have a reason to play football this year if he doesn't want to. In terms of leverage, he has a lot of it. They kind of need him. So I don't think he's going to play. I don't think he's going to play if he doesn't have the contract week 1 against the New York Jets, which is a team you probably want to have him out there for compared to any team. So, yeah, I'd be a little bit concerned. Now, how does that impact the rest of the offense? This offensive line is not good outside of him. And that's kind of just what they get away with, the way that they run their offense. Similar things happened in Miami last year. Just getting the ball out quick, getting it in space, getting it to the outside, having fast players to do that helps. But if you drop Trent Williams off this offensive line, you could argue with me that it's probably a bottom 5 unit and towards the bottom of that list as well in the NFL.
Yeah, people look at the splits when Deebo Samuel missed games last year, but Trent Williams also missed those games last year too. And, when he struggled a little bit in a couple of drives in the Super Bowl, he had back-to-back penalties or something like that very early on in the game. I was like, what's going on? This is a guy that never makes these type of mistakes. And I think it set the offense back a little bit because, as you mentioned, those are the rest of the guys on that team are they're fine for the system, but they're not true individual difference makers and not high caliber starters, where Trent Williams certainly fits into that boat. So if we're getting to week 1, the games are about to kick off and Trent Williams they haven't figured out his contract situation, I mean, I don't know what you're going to do. Like, I don't think you're docking Christian McCaffrey off the first overall pick. I don't think you're, maybe you're not drafting around those receivers, anything like that. Maybe you're not taking Brock Purdy as a QB1, but I don't know. It forces me to reconsider the entire offense a little bit. That is for sure. Okay, let's move on to the next one here. This one comes in from Anthony. He picked him up. It's a beautiful gif of Trevor Lawrence here for the people watching on YouTube. They can see that. Picked him up as my second quarterback in the Superflex League. I'm a little worried about him. I feel like I shouldn't be worried, but I am. Love the conviction on your worry there. You're clearly not even sure if you should be panicked about this, Anthony. But Sal, how do you feel about Trevor Lawrence and the Jaguars offense this year?
Yeah, Anthony just simply needs someone to talk to, and I'm here to be that person for him. I'm not worried at all. He's your second quarterback in a Superflex. That's great. I mean, this is a guy you didn't have to spend any real capital on in your draft. He's probably going to be near a top 10 pass offense again this year, and he quietly has a lot of mobile upside. Last year, while dealing with an ankle sprain, he was top 10 in rushing yards per game amongst quarterbacks. He had 4 rushing touchdowns. He's 220 pounds. He's a huge quarterback, so like in the goal line around the red zone, there's always a chance that he can hold it, get you a couple extra points in that regard from touchdowns. So yeah, I'm not too concerned. And when you look at this division overall, like on paper entering the season, you have the Jaguars, the Colts, the Titans. Those are some of the worst secondary units in terms of personnel. Even the Texans, who have like the best investment, some young players on their secondary, it's not a top 10 unit. Like maybe it could be at the end of the year. So you might just see a lot of spots in these divisional games where you're having some shootouts, targeting those secondaries, and that helps Lawrence as well. So yeah, I'm not concerned at all. I mean, if he was your QB1, I wouldn't even be massively concerned in like a standard format league, but QB2 in a Superflex is fine.
No, I think this is great. And it's interesting to note too that like in a season where talk about the panic meter, Sal. We talked about Trevor Lawrence and the Jaguars offense a lot last year in the People's Panic Meter segment with Andy Behrens, to the point that Andy was like, I don't even know what to say anymore. Trevor Lawrence in that season where people were constantly panicking about him, it felt like a huge disappointment. He was still QB12. And I know like end of season quarterback stats is just like who stayed healthy, whatever, but he's going to QB16 this year. We're already anticipating a step back from a season that was frustrating last year. And I'm not even sure that that's warranted because I'm not necessarily enthralled with the Jaguars this year. Their on paper personnel is still not great, but I'm really intrigued with Brian Thomas, who I think could bring a development and sort of a dimension of this offense that they have not had with Trevor Lawrence, like a true outside the numbers ball winner, a true speed vertical threat as both an X and a player that they can move around. Christian Kirk is still there. Evan Ingram is still there as kind of layup targets over the middle. So I think you can squint and say, like, if Brian Thomas really, really hits, like, I think he is an important player and a player that I'm really into drafting this year. But if he hits, he really helps this offense. Like Trevor Lawrence could maybe be the QB 8 or 9 this year. And in those shootout divisional games that you mentioned, those are offenses we're also excited about too. At least certainly in Indianapolis and Houston. So for me, I actually really like Trevor Lawrence this year. I expect him to maybe not be a QB1, but certainly be a high-end QB2.
Yeah, he's a guy that, like, maybe a couple of weeks ago, I was like, I got to get a quarterback by Jaden Daniels or Caleb Williams in drafts. But then you see Trevor Lawrence goes like an extra round or two after those guys. And I'm like, okay, yeah, I could even wait a little more if I'm just trying to take a really late quarterback. He's probably the stop point at where I feel comfortable with a QB1.
All right, let's move on to @Stooge and a Clown. That's very self-aware of you to just call yourself that right off the bat. Rachaad White. The coaching staff seems to really like Bucky Irving. This is an interesting one here with the Bucky Irving, Rachaad White situation. Where do you come down on this one, man? Because I have not been, we talked about this early in the week with Dwayne McFarland. Rachaad White's not a guy that I like proactively draft, but when he falls to a certain point, I'm okay taking him. But at the same time, I think there is some risk that if he remains a very inefficient runner, Bucky Irving could really carve into his workload.
Yeah, I'm kind of the same way. In round 3, where he goes ADP-wise, not really interested. When he falls into round 4, even at that point, there's just wide receivers, Malik Neighbors in that range. But if I had to, late round 4, mid round 4 is where I start to get a little bit more interested. I think I'm just more concerned about the offensive coaching change. I don't really know what to make of Bucky Irving at this point. Like, as a prospect, I wasn't huge on him. He's a little bit undersized, and in terms of like relative speed compared to other players his size, not great, which isn't awesome in terms of in between the tackles and getting to the outside. You factor in pass protection concerns, and it's like, okay, what's going on here? But if they like him, they're obviously seeing improvement in camp, and those things happen, especially for a young rookie player. So maybe a small bit of concern going there, but he's kind of just the RB2 by default. They didn't bring anybody in free agency. Chase Edmonds, I believe, landed on season-ending IR, so he's going to be involved for sure. I'm more so concerned with Dave Canales gone, who gave Rachaad White the second most touches in the NFL, just 3 touches behind Christian McCaffrey last year. Liam Cohn comes in. He does have a history of giving running backs touches. Ray Davis in college last year, I think, was seeing 18 to 20 touches per game. But how does that translate now into this offense? A little bit of concern, but you don't have to draft Rachaad White as like a second-round running back.
Yeah, I think that he's another one of these guys that this is the tough thing with rankings, right? Because I have Rachaad White ranked, around where he goes, maybe even a little bit ahead of running back 14, like running back 12, 13, 14, I think is totally fair for him. It's just when you look at the overall ADP of the players that he goes around, Michael Pittman at wide receiver, Devontae Smith, DJ Moore, DK Metcalf, Lamar Jackson, even like Trey McBride at tight end. I'd really rather take almost all of those guys than Rachaad White, which is just why I don't end up getting him a lot. So not really panicking about him. But I do understand sort of the concerns. If Bucky Irving, mixes in it all, then he really becomes a potential guy where he looks like a floor projection does Rachaad White, but he could really have that floor taken out from under him if Bucky Irving does get involved. All right, let's move on to the last one here. Colin Walker says, I drafted Derrick Henry, Jalen Warren, and Chase. Colin, I'm assuming that this is Jamar. I thought it was Jamar Chase, but now I'm assuming it's Chase Brown. I'm just saying, like, gotta give us the full names, buddy. Gotta give us the full names. And Blake Corum they drafted as well. I'm worried about week 1 output of running backs after Derrick Henry. Chuba Hubbard is on the waiver wire. Should I pick him up and drop Hollywood Brown for guaranteed early season production, or chill TF out and wait? Sal, usually if you say, should I chill TF out, you probably should. But what's your advice in this particular scenario? Are you panicking about the week 1 output of guys like Jalen Warren with the injury, Chase Brown with the mixed up backfield, and obviously Blake Corum as a guy that's rising, but maybe is certainly not going to be the starting running back in week 1?
Yeah, I could see where some worries start to come in about your RB2 position. It's probably just like based on the way you drafted, you took these guys, and I think probably around 8, 9, 10, around that range. So you probably have some loaded wide receivers. That's why you're questioning, should you drop Marquise Brown? I'm going to say no, just like based on the value. He was probably like an 8th round pick for you. He's going to be back maybe as soon as week 2 or week 3. See how that plays out. Could be like a dark horse number 1 receiver for the Chiefs and Mahomes, and you definitely want that at that point. So I just roll with what you got. See, if Jalen Warren plays completely fine, start him week 1, go for it. But if you really wanted to, I would say Chuba Hubbard, you're going to have a month. He's going to have a nice couple of first matchups of the season like we discussed earlier. So I would say Corum would be the guy to drop just in terms of usage right away, but that's somebody that's going to get scooped up immediately. Yeah. So just know that you're giving a little bit of upside away for Chuba Hubbard, who by week 8 probably not going to do much for you, and that's exactly where Blake Corum could start actually helping you win weeks. Right now I'd hold off, but there's a full analysis of it if you need it.
I think that makes a lot of sense because I certainly don't want to drop Blake Corum. I don't really want to drop Marquise Brown either, because he might miss a couple games to start the season, but he's still a good NFL receiver. Not a superstar, but he's a good NFL receiver tied to the best quarterback on the planet. Like, I don't really want to drop that guy unless the injury really lingers. And look, also with Jalen Warren and Chase Brown, those are 2 running backs I expect to be the values in that backfield. So we could come out of week 1 and Colin, all of a sudden you're thinking, man, like, I got a potential RB2 here in Jalen Warren, or I got a really nice breakout candidate in Chase Brown. You just don't know it heading into week 1. So my advice would be to chill the F out and wait. Pretty much like you said, you probably should. See, Colin, you knew the answer. You didn't even really need to ask us on this one. Okay, there's no panic in that situation. Honestly, Sal, a lot of these players we have not panicked on, maybe except for the 49ers example, the Devontae Adams thing. We're panicked a little bit about that. Jonathan Brooks, some minor panic, but not a ton of panic from you and I, Sal. But after the break, we're going to come back and you're going to share the 3 guys that you are panicked about, truly panicked about heading into the season right after this. All right, Sal, we tasked you with coming up with a secret list of 3 guys that do have you a little bit panicked heading into this season. Because look, sometimes the people, they're just in their feelings. And look, we love you, okay, listeners, fantasy community. Life is too short for that kind of panic, okay? Life is too short to be panicked about Jahmyr Gibbs with David Montgomery. But Sal, sometimes there are situations that really have us worried. And as a smart guy, you're going to tell us those three that we really need to care about here. So give me number one on your list.
Yeah, I'm going to be vulnerable here with you, Matt, so I trust you on these. The first one is Christian Kirk, who is somebody that early on in the summer I was drafting a lot of as usually a 7th-round pick, and he kind of goes in a similar range right now. But I think things maybe haven't totally worked against him, but there's just these small things popping up that are giving me some concern. The biggest one is Brian Thomas. Brian Thomas was not having maybe the most outstanding beginning of camp, but the last 2 to 3 weeks, it's really come on, and it's come on strong. And when you start to say how he fits into this offense, it looks good. You see Evan Ingram in the preseason having 2 touchdowns, continuing to look good with Trevor Lawrence, led all tight ends in targets and receptions kind of quietly last season. So those are 2 weapons already in the offense. And now I'm starting to wonder if Brian Thomas is winning in the deep to intermediate parts of the field, if Ingram's controlling that middle part of the field. Obviously, there's going to be some work for Christian Kirk, but is it as much as I once thought 4 to 6 to 8 weeks ago? This is where some concerns come in. You could look at that first preseason game when Kirk wasn't on the field in 2 wide receiver sets. It's just 5 to 10 snaps. You can't take too much from that. They might have just wanted to see a formation with the rookie on the outside, how it works. But it's something that happened that's also, I'm already a little concerned. Then I see that. Now I'm getting a little scared.
Yeah, we are publishing our wide receiver fades piece on the site. It will be up today as people are listening to this. And mine was Christian Kirk. So we're actually on the same page with this one. Look, Christian Kirk goes as like 70th overall player. You draft Christian Kirk and it doesn't work out. He's not going to sink your whole fantasy season. So maybe a cowardly call by me to make him my wide receiver fade, but he's just a guy that I've been drafting around, and in an area where I think you really got to get those receiver picks right. He is a guy that goes in a range that I'm not really trying to take a player with his path to upside, because I think there are some pretty serious blocks in terms of his path to upside. You laid out Brian Thomas as the biggest one. Again, to go back to the episode that we taped early this week with Dwayne McFarland, I said, and of course the social media team posted it, shout out to them, I'd rather have Brian Thomas straight up at this point over Christian Kirk. I think by the end of the season, he will be the number 1 receiver on this team. Evan Ingram's role overlaps a little bit with Kirk. I think Kirk is a good player, but he's a slot mostly guy. And we haven't said the name Gabe Davis yet, Sal, and because Gabe Davis is not a target earner, but he's a snap eater. He is going to be on the field pretty much for every single snap and doing his thing, which is mostly running vertical routes and not getting a lot of separation and not getting a lot of targets. But that still is going to impact everybody else in terms of their target ceilings in the offense. So I think Kirk can still be a decent wide receiver 3, maybe. But there's no real path to a ceiling there anymore, because I think Brian Thomas is kind of established himself enough to this point.
Yeah, I think we're on the same page there. The next guy that I have, though, is somebody who goes earlier. So, like, you get a 70th overall, like you were saying with Christian Kirk, it won't kill you. But this guy goes in round 3 in most drafts, and it's Mike Evans of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I mean, maybe the most consistent player in NFL history, 10 straight seasons of 1,000+ yards. But he's now 31 years old, which, you should bring up in terms of when those wide receivers start to fall off. It's something to think about. And it seems like Chris Godwin's getting a little bit more involved in the offense in terms of being used in the right way. Liam Cohen this offseason has stated multiple times via Coach Speak Index on Twitter that, they're going to put Chris Godwin back in the slot. We saw that in a very limited sample of 7 snaps in the preseason. He was in the slot for 6 of those, where he's been more efficient, especially as an aging receiver. So does he start to earn more targets from Baker Mayfield? Baker Mayfield in general got paid $100 million this offseason. He was not in a prove-it year anymore. He proved it, and he got a bag. So how does he come into this season now? We'll see what happens there. And there's a brand new coach, of course, in terms of offensive coordinator, Dave Canales being gone with Liam Cohen coming in. How does that work in terms of how you're using the receivers? Canales was using them in a very specific way, helping Baker Mayfield's strengths. We're hoping that continues, but it's not just guaranteed to be carbon copied over.
Oh, this one's tough, man. My super basic analysis on this, which is not how I really feel, it just feels like I never quite get the Mike Evans, Chris Godwin thing right in terms of like which is the right year to be on, because both of these guys are really good players, and at times I actually think before Chris Godwin tore his ACL, I thought there was a very narrow gap between those two guys. Like I thought Godwin was really rising up to be, kind of in that. I think he's topped out as maybe being one of the best of the best number 2 receivers, but he was certainly creeping up on Evans in terms of like his overall rankings among the league's pantheon of wide receivers. But these last few years, it's been, I thought Godwin might be a better fit with Baker Mayfield than Mike Evans was, but the way they used him wasn't totally right. The way that, Mike Evans was just deployed on all these outbreaking routes, which is what Baker Mayfield loves to throw. He doesn't love to work the middle of the field. He loves to throw those outbreaking routes to the field because that's just where he's more comfortable working because of how tall he is and just the way he plays the position. So how much of that is going to map over from Dave Canales' offense to Liam Cohen's offense? How much is Cohen going to come in here and just say, hey, what worked with last year works for me? Jalen McMillan is also a guy who's been getting hype. That's certainly a part to point of this too, the rookie wide receiver. But at the same time, Sal, the only reason I can't get fully on board with you about panicking about Mike Evans is last year Evans saw 136 targets. Chris Godwin saw 130. Nobody else saw more than 70. I think that's maybe Jalen McMillan can establish himself to be like a 75 target receiver, something like that. But I think that would be a little bit of a stretch just based on how I view him as a player. So like in terms of just the overall volume in the offense, I think there's still more than enough for Evans to at least maybe meet his ADP, maybe not crush it. Because for Godwin, we're just asking him to score a few more touchdowns. Like we don't need him to see more than 130 targets to be of value at his respective ADP. So I'm not panicked on Mike Evans. I think he's okay as a 3rd round pick, but I do hear some of your points of concern on this one.
Thank you. You've calmed my nerves a good amount. I feel good now. And to add an extra bonus, the offensive line should be improved, adding Graham Barton, which should only help things.
Yeah, and their 2nd round pick last year, Cody Mock, I think should just be more equipped to handle the NFL. Like he was a guy coming from a small school last year, day 2 draft pick. Like rookie offensive lineman can really struggle. They got great play out of Luke Gadecki. Tristan Wirfs is one of the best left tackles in the league now at this point. I think that improvement on the offensive line is actually the most important note here that could help the run game, but also could help the pass game too. Like a guy like Baker, maybe every quarterback is worse under pressure than they are when they're kept clean. But for Baker, he's always been a guy that when you can protect him, you're going to get the best out of him. So that's a good thing to note here too. All right, give me your last one, Sal. Let's go. Let's hear the last player that you're panicked on. Hopefully this one you finish with a bang.
Yeah, so the last one is actually one that a listener had earlier, so we're sharing some concerns here, and it is Jonathan Brooks, the Panthers running back, 2nd round pick. It's not a concern around the recent news. Like I said, we've kind of already known that he's going to miss a couple of weeks. Like that's something I already knew. Okay, he's going to miss an extra game. There is that chance that it's more, but we're going to assume we get him back for week 5. It's more so the concern now that Chuba Hubbard has that first 4 weeks to potentially, in some good matchups, look good, which maybe takes until now like week 7 or 8 instead of right away week 5 when Jonathan Brooks starts to take over. It at least increases the risk of a timeshare for a little bit more, which is not really what I want when I'm spending a draft pick on him. The nice thing is he seems to, at least in live drafts right now, be falling a round or 2, but that is where my concerns come in right now, especially in a lot of drafts earlier this summer if you were spending like that 8th round pick on him.
How could you think the Panthers offense is going to be this year? Like that I think is a big question to this. I mean, I don't know. I'm not going to speak for you, Sal. I think that they're going to be better than they were last year, which is not saying very much, but how high do you think this offense can fly this year?
Yeah, if they get near league average, I think that's a massive win for them. They've done everything they possibly could have in terms of supporting Bryce Young. I think the offensive line might be the 2nd most improved unit behind the Jets heading into this year, which should help everybody around them. They brought in some pieces as well. Obviously, Deontay Johnson, 1st round pick. Xavier Legette, been banged up in camp, maybe starts to get going a little bit as the season starts. So, I mean, if they finish as the 20th, 18th offense in the NFL, I think that's a massive win after what they were last year, dead last in yards per play, just averaging like something putrid below like 5 yards per play. So anything above that is a win.
There's a couple of the reason I ask that is because I think the popular comparison for Jonathan Brooks in the optimistic case is, well, look at what Breece Hall did last year. I think there's a couple of the one good point for Jonathan Brooks here is that I think he's going to play in a better offense than what Breece Hall played in last year. Whatever Bryce Young is, whatever Dave Canales is, it will be better than Nate Hackett and friggin' Tim Boyle or Trevor Siemian or whatever. Okay, so that's just point 1 in Brooks' favor. The 2 things that I think are problematic for Jonathan Brooks is, one, whatever Jonathan Brooks is, I think he's probably not going to be as good as Breece Hall. Panthers fans can feel free to be optimistic about Jonathan Brooks and like, hey, I'm an idiot and maybe I look like an idiot. Maybe Jonathan Brooks is the best back in the league, but Breece Hall is one of the best running backs in the league. So I don't necessarily think there's a lot of competition there. But your point about Chuba Hubbard, which, oh my God, this must be the most any podcast has freaking talked about Chuba Hubbard in the last few weeks. I think Chuba Hubbard is better than whatever 2023 Dalvin Cook was, right? If we're still using this Breece Hall comparison. So the thing I think that if you're panicking about Brooks, you've really got to believe that Chuba Hubbard is good enough to hold down a 1B-ish, or maybe even just the straight up. I don't think he'll end up holding the top job, but just be like a real member of a committee with Jonathan Brooks, because if you're drafting Brooks, you're hoping he comes back and he's just a set it and forget it running back for you. If he's a guy that's in a murky committee on an offense that's at best 18th, 20th, I think that's where some of the panic comes in. I just don't know if I totally feel that way about Chuba Hubbard, Sal, but that's sort of the crux. Somehow that's the crux of this discussion here, is how good is Chuba Hubbard?
Yeah, and it could obviously go either way. Hubbard can absolutely stink those first couple of games, and they have to get Miles Sanders involved, and that's just looking ugly, right. And they can't wait to get Jonathan Brooks back. But it just it opens the door now for that chance of maybe a longer committee, because even when Brooks comes back, he's not seeing a full workload week 5 if that's when he comes back. They're probably going to give him a week or two to just ramp up back from the injury first games in the NFL.
Man, fantasy football season is here. Sal, because we are like, man, we got to know what Chuba Hubbard looks like in week 1. We are itching for it. That will really tell us, okay, when we get the multi-box up on the YouTube Sunday ticket, man, we got to have the Panthers up there, because I got to see what Chuba Hubbard looks like to unlock my entire fantasy season. That is how you know it's right around the corner. That is how you know week 1 is right around the corner. It's less than 2 weeks away, people. Speaking of that, as you know from the countless live reads, we have a little thing going on with NBC Sports this year. If you don't want to be dialed in to the Carolina Panthers in week 1, which fair enough, I've got some options for what you can really be dialed into in week 1, because if you sign up for a fantasy league on Yahoo Fantasy, you're going to be automatically entered to win $1 million. Boom. That's pretty electric. But if any of the players you start score a touchdown in the week 1 games on NBC and Peacock, spoiler alert, the Carolina Panthers are not among that cohort. Shocking. But some really good teams are. And if you start any of those players and they score a touchdown in those week 1 games, you will earn bonus entries into the sweepstakes. The deadline, it's rapidly approaching. It is September 5th. So get on it, draft a league, draft some players from those week 1 games on NBC and Peacock, and cross your fingers that you find some touchdowns along the way. Sal, buddy, that is going to do it for us today. Really appreciate you stopping in, maybe soothing some panic, being vulnerable enough to offer up your own panic. That takes, some real strength there as a person. Sal Vetri, appreciate you doing this one. Tell the people what you've got working on as week 1 rapidly approaches.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it, Matt. Yeah, anything that I have coming out from Yahoo or any other outlets, you'll be able to see just on my Twitter at Sal Vetri DFS. I have a piece coming out on Yahoo at the end of the week that's kind of be in this similar vein, just everything we've learned over the past month or so that's going to impact fantasy. That'll be up on Friday. The most important takeaways from basically the preseason.
Boom. We love it. Absolutely electric. Of course, you got to be following Sal on social media. He is the king over there. So make sure you're dialed into everything he's posting. If there's something you need to know about fantasy football before the season, during the season, whatever, trust me, you're going to find it from Sal. He is as dialed in as anybody is to this fun little game that we play. Like I said, that is going to do it for us today. On Friday, we conclude Cram Week with our draft season coverage of the very special episode of the pod. All of our Yahoo Fantasy analysts, including both me and Sal, are going to share their final pieces of draft advice as you head into the weekend when most people draft fantasy teams. So probably pretty good timing on that. Until then, we're out.